So in this video, we're going to be talking about taxonomy, which is something super exciting because it's something that I got to study quite a bit in university. So I'm really excited to share it with you today. So taxonomy is used because many hundreds of years ago, before they came up with this system, it was really difficult to kind of interact with people that were from different areas of the world about animals because everyone was using their own system. So taxonomy was created to classify and name organisms with a certain set rules that was universal throughout the whole world. So it's kind of similar to the idea of the periodic table where every element has its own symbol and everyone kind of knows and uses that same kind of symbol to represent the certain elements that they're using. So taxonomy is kind of the same thing where it's using the same set of rules to name organisms, and this is what we use to classify living things based on what they look like, what they eat, their genetic makeup, all of that different stuff that they use to kind of take into consideration. So there are different groupings that we have. So basically that's what we're going to write down under taxon. So the taxonomical grouping. We're going to go from the largest groupings, which are called domains, all the way down to the smallest. So there are 3 domains that we're going to talk about later in this video. Within the domains, there are 6 different kingdoms. And within the kingdoms, there's a whole bunch of different phylums. So as we get down towards the bottom of the list, this is getting more and more specific groupings. That means there's more groupings, but that means that there's less amount of organisms in each grouping. So if there was looking at the domains, because there's only 3 of them in the entire world, there's going to be hundreds of thousands or millions of organisms within each domain. And as we go down into phylums, we're going to have less and less organisms. Okay, then we go down to the classes, the orders, the families, and then the genus and species. Now that's kind of just a bunch of random words. So it's how do you remember all that stuff? So what I did and what I've always used, and in fact I use this still to this day, like I was making this video and I was figuring out how many columns to put into it, and I had to actually say the mnemonic device in my head to figure out what it is. So instead of trying to remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, I used the mnemonic device instead, which is going to be a sentence that has the same letter of each word as the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, blah, 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 blah. So I use did King Philip come over for grape soda. So each start of the word begins with the very first letter of the other word to remember the order of the domains, the kingdoms, the phylums, because I feel like it's really easy to mix up. I find it difficult with class, order, and family, so I literally have to use this mnemonic device every single time. So we're going to go through humans, because we're all humans, and figure out what our taxonomical groups are. So we start with, we are a eukaryote, which means that we are a multicellular organism. We're not bacteria, so that would be our domain. Then we go down into our kingdom, we're animals. We're not a fungus, we're not a plant, we're not a protist or a different other type of bacteria, we're animals. So all of the animals are in the same grouping. And then our phylum is called chordata, which means that we have a spine. So anything that also has a spine is also in the same grouping with us in the same phylum. Now, when I was in university, I took invertebrate and vertebrate zoology classes. And in that, the vertebrate zoology class, that was studying everything in phylum chordata. Everything that has a spine are called vertebrates. Now, invertebrates are anything that doesn't have a spine. So that includes like jellyfish and sea cucumbers and starfish and worms and all of these different things. And I got to dissect a different species of something every single week, and it was super awesome. So I'm a huge fan of invertebrates. They would be like the only animals that are not in the phylum chordata. They have their own phylums, which I got to learn all about when I was in university. We got to study a different phylum every week. So then our class, we are mammals. So we're in the class Mammalia. Our order, we are in the grouping primates based on similar kind of structures as primates. And then we're in the family Hominidae. And then our genus and species name is Homo sapiens. So all of the other organisms in the genus Homo would be all of the other human-like species like Homo erectus, and if you wanted to study anthropology, you would be studying all of the organisms that are in the same genus as us, which are all other human-like species, and unfortunately, Homo sapiens are the only human-like species left in the world. But yeah, if you're ever interested in learning more about that, there is a whole stream of science called anthropology that you guys can study. So now that we know a little bit more about our human taxonomical groupings, this was just another example that I wanted to show you. So for a bobcat, they're also in domain Eukarya because they're multicellular. They're also animals. They also have a spine, and they're also mammals, which means that they produce milk and they give live birth and all that fun stuff. But this is where they differ from us. Instead of being in the order primates, they're in the order carnivora, which includes dogs and cougars and like different types of cats. And then Felidae is all of the different types of cats. And then they go down into the genus and the species Lynx rufus, which specifically is for bobcats. So that is their taxonomical grouping, but you could go through literally any organism and look at what domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species they have for their specific thing. And remember, because it's taxonomy, it's a well-known kind of classification system throughout the whole world. So even if you go to a different country, they would still be using the same domain, kingdom, phylum, class, and all that fun stuff. So when we look at the genus and the species name, this is called binomial nomenclature. So that's something that I studied a lot in university, and I had to actually remember all of the different genus and species names for every single organism that I was studying. I had to be able to spell it right. Some of them I had to be able to identify based on the call that they made. So I had to memorize all of the calls of different frogs and toads and birds. And that was part of the thing that I had to do in the lab, is identify their genus and species names based on their call. So this was just to show you guys basically what we're looking at is what we call the tree of life. So it's showing the 3 different domains that we use to break down our organisms into different groupings. So we have bacteria and archaea and eukarya. When we look at animals, we often think that that's going to be like a huge chunk of the tree of life. But in reality, there's so many different types of bacteria that we kind of forget that there's so much kind of variety within it. Even within the multicellular organisms, animals is just one small piece. So we have to remember that we're just kind of a small piece of the tree of life. And there's so many other different kind of offshoots than just animals and plants and things like that. So when we're talking about the different domains, we have to know a little bit about each one. So bacteria are what we call prokaryotic, which means that they are single-celled or unicellular. There's one cell within each bacteria. They do not have membrane-bound nucleus, so that means that the nucleus that they have has no membrane around it. And they usually use asexual reproduction to reproduce, which means that they normally just split into 2, and then those 2 split into 4, and then those 4 split into 8, and so on. And we call them autotrophs because a lot of them are doing photosynthesis, but they can also do a process called chemosynthesis, which is basically photosynthesis but without using light. So they are able to do this process like deep down in the ocean where there's no access to sunlight. They can basically do a slightly different process as photosynthesis to do the same, basically the whole process the same way, but just starting without sunlight. And then flagella is just the tiny little projections that are on them. So like this, like little tails that will push them around. So that's how they actually move around. Archaea bacteria is very similar to actual normal bacteria. Also prokaryotic, also unicellular, also does not have a nucleus that has a membrane. They also produce asexually. The difference between archaea and bacteria is archaea bacteria does not ever do photosynthesis. They always do chemosynthesis, which again is for organisms that live in areas that have no sunlight, so like really, really deep down in oceans, sometimes in soil and stuff like that. And then the eukaryotic organisms, which means that they have multicellular, which means that they have a nucleus that has a membrane around it. They most of the time reproduce sexually, but that's not the case for every single thing. It's just kind of a generalization. And then when they're eating, they all eat in different ways. So for example, like a jellyfish is going to be eating different than a human, which is going to be eating different than a fungus, which is going to be eating different than a plant. So every grouping within the eukaryotes, they all get their energy in different ways. When we're talking about the eukaryotes, because it's such a big grouping, there's actually 6 kingdoms within those eukaryotes that we use, and it's just based on how they get food. So all of the species in plants are autotrophs, for example. They do photosynthesis, whereas animals are heterotrophs, which means that they have to get food by eating. So we basically just look on how they acquire their food, and we have grouped them based on that. So this is our 3 domains. We have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Eukarya I made as the biggest because it has the most amount of kingdoms within it. Our 6 kingdoms, so bacteria, the kingdom that bacteria is in is also bacteria. The kingdom that archaea is in is called Archaea Bacteria. And then the rest is our eukaryotes. So we have protista, which are protists. So they're kind of like, look similar to single-celled organisms, but they're things like amoebas and stuff like that. Fungus or fungi. So things like mushrooms and mold and stuff like that. And plants, so plantae, and animalia. So those are all the things, the kingdoms that we separate. So bacteria goes down into bacteria, archaea goes into archaea bacteria, and then eukaryote includes one, two, three, four, all of those. This is another picture showing the tree of life, just so you guys could see it a little bit more in detail. So the bacteria is all the blue stuff. So different types of bacteria, different types of archaea, and then the eukaryotes, we have a whole bunch of different types. So plants like mosses and ferns and all that fun stuff. And then animals, we know animals usually a little bit more in detail. So remember, I took a class in university about all of these organisms, all of the invertebrates, which means they don't have a spine. And then the vertebrates, I took another class all about. So about the fish and the birds and the reptiles and the mammals. And so I know so much about this part of the tree of life. I also took a botany class, so I studied all of the plants in quite a lot of detail, but I didn't learn much about bacteria or archaea or any of these other types of organisms that are in the tree of life. So yeah, I find this super interesting. I find like learning the names of stuff super interesting, and something that had I been able to go back to university and take more classes, I would have definitely taken more zoology classes and learned a little bit more about this because I just find it super interesting. So when we're talking about a species, so how do we decide what is a species? The species is always based on the structural similarities that they have, so morphological structures, based on stuff like that. So for example, an ostrich, which is a bird, they're in Struthio genus, and all of them have 2 toes instead of 3 or 4. So that is what groups them into the genus that they're in. Now, binomial nomenclature, I kind of mentioned earlier, remember, is using the genus and the species part of the name in order to just be like the actual name of the species. Like humans are Homo sapiens. But this is kind of like your specific name, which is the most specific to you, almost like your first and last name. But it's kind of backwards to how we have names because our first name is just us, and then our last name is the same as everyone else in our family. So it'd be kind of like that, whereas Homo sapiens are the genus is first, which is more broad, which would be kind of more like the name that everyone has in that grouping. And then sapiens is just specific to the one type of species, kind of like our first name versus our last name. And then I'm sure you guys have heard of E. coli before. E. coli is the actual scientific name for the bacteria. It stands for I don't even want to attempt to say this, Escherichia, Escherichia coli, which they shorten to E. coli. So you've seen that binomial nomenclature name before. You just might not have recognized it as its actual scientific name, but every single species has its own scientific name with its genus and species. Like, for example, bison, their scientific name is literally bison. So just a little fun tidbit to end off the video. And that's all I have to teach you about taxonomy today. You should be able to understand at the end of this like the difference between the different groupings and what order they go in. So remembering domain is like the largest grouping, the least specific, and then as we go down the table, the species is the most specific and would have the least amount of animals in it. There are practice questions after these notes. I think it's one entire page of practice questions if you guys can try that out, just so you can see kind of what I would be asking on a multiple choice question about taxonomy. But other than that, you guys are good to go. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.